Good evening. My name is Michael Cowan. As the current president of this campus's Emeriti Association, I want, on behalf of our members, to welcome you to this evening's lecture. It will be followed by a brief opportunity, if you wish, to ask Bill Friedland some questions, and we'll conclude with a reception in the lobby, to which you are all warmly invited. For the past 10 years, our association, with the generous co-sponsorship of the Chancellor, has periodically presented public lectures by Emeriti on topics of broad interest. As these lectures clearly demonstrate, formal retirement does not mean settling into a gentle routine of late breakfasts, leisurely lunches, and afternoon naps. Some Emeriti have returned to the classroom on recall to meet critical curricular needs. Many have engaged in creative service to a variety of community organizations in and beyond the Santa Cruz area. And most have continued to pursue actively productive research agendas. Our speaker this evening, Bill Friedland, Professor Emeritus of Community Studies and Sociology and current holder of the title Research Professor, is an exemplary embodiment of such ongoing contributions to the welfare of the campus, community, and larger profession. We might find it rather striking that someone who grew up in a borough of New York City should become an internationally eminent sociologist of agriculture. On the other hand, as Bill himself has observed, possibly with a wink, Staten Island was the most rural borough in New York. Still, the road to Professor Friedland's groundbreaking research was not direct. It took him, among other places, to Detroit from 1940 to 1953 as an automobile shop worker and steward, and as an activist in the UAW and CIO, then to a doctorate and his faculty appointment in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell as an industrial sociologist. It was at Cornell that he developed an innovative educational program that would have profound implications for UC Santa Cruz. He recruited a cadre of undergraduates to a spring semester seminar on field study that prepared them for a summer immersion as agricultural workers and researchers in migrant labor camps, followed during the fall semester by a seminar in which they engaged in an academic analysis of their experiences. This program, the Cornell Migrant Labor Project, was to become the model for this campus's own community studies program, which Bill founded in 1969 upon his arrival at UCSC as Professor of Community Studies and Sociology. Although it is difficult to characterize adequately the general contours of Bill's multifaceted academic career, two themes in particular stand out for me. First, his commitment as a scholar to engage in rigorous research that contributes to a more just and humane society, one in which productive labor of all varieties is valued and honored. Second, his commitment as a teacher to challenging students to confront, by direct community involvement, the processes and problems characteristic of the multifaceted society in which we live, to helping them develop the skills of rigorous academic analysis that will lead them to a complex, nuanced understanding of that society in its local, regional, national, and global formations, and to encouraging them to continue after graduation to apply their education to the betterment of the communities in which they will work and live. Let me speak briefly to each of these themes. During his over 5 decades as an active scholarship scholarship that has maintained its brisk pace since his retirement in 1991, Bill has authored or co-authored a dozen major books and monographs and dozens of influential articles. One of his important contributions has been to apply the perspectives of industrial psychology, or sociology, to a socioeconomic analysis of agriculture as a complex network of production and commodity systems involving, among other things, the corporatization of agribusiness, the mechanization of growing, harvesting, and processing, the profound impact on both agricultural workers and growers, and the rise of labor activism. He has written importantly about tomatoes, lettuce, and other crop production systems, as well as more generally about the political economy of dominant and alternative forms of agricultural production. Bill has also made important contributions to the sociology of knowledge in his analyses of the impact of the university's own fiscal and political relationship to agribusiness on the kinds of agricultural research that scholars in the university have been encouraged and discouraged to pursue. He has consistently called on his professional colleagues to engage in socially responsible research that considers the impacts of agricultural transformations on workers, growers, and consumers, as well as on the environment. He has repeatedly asked how academic institutions can encourage scientists to be less exclusively focused on increasing agricultural output and more concerned with the social consequences of their research. And he has proposed, in the face of considerable resistance, that the university require social impact statements for all publicly funded research. Such research has made Bill a central international figure in the field of the sociology of agriculture and has resulted in several major professional honors for his contributions to the field. In 2005, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Rural Sociological Society. In 2012, he was named Distinguished Rural Sociologist by that society at its 75th annual meeting, and lauded for his role as mentor and inspiration to many rural sociologists who study the social impacts of changing structures of agriculture. During that same year, a plenary session at the 13th World Congress of World Sociology in Lisbon, Portugal, was designated Homage to Bill Friedland. This dedication is rarely given and was awarded in honor of his many years of research on alternative agri-food movements. Bill's commitment to a searching examination of the impact of institutional arrangements on the lives of those engaged in productive work and on the efforts of workers to better their working and living conditions has also led to his scholarly interest in student welfare and activism. His 1971 book, for example, The Knowledge Factory, Student Power and Academic Politics, co-authored with sociologist Irving Horowitz, remains, in my view, one of the most nuanced and insightful analyses of the student movements of the 1960s and of the university administrators and faculty's responses to those movements. This interest has also been central to his conception of the Community Studies program at UCSC. Bill has often pointed to the achievements of community studies as one of his greatest sources of satisfaction. His powerful and innovative conception of the program, which has graduated nearly 3,000 majors during its 40-plus years of existence, involved the systematic integration of three components: a student's 6 months field placements in community organizations, often serving underserved populations, a prior preparatory seminar involving careful consideration of the ethical as well as the methodological and practical issues involved in participant observation in the field, and a post-fieldwork seminar focused on rigorous academic analysis of those experiences and leading each student to the production of a substantial senior thesis. But Bill's commitment to developing undergraduates' research skills and harnessing those skills to projects for positive social change did not end there. Under his leadership, the program's faculty engaged teams of students in extended research projects that focused on important social issues. Among them, several that over the years have focused on issues of concern to the Santa Cruz community and have typically involved extensive systematic interviews with local residents and community leaders. Among such studies bearing Bill's own direct mark are the Santa Cruz Freeway study of the early 1970s and the 1985 co-authored study, Street People and Straight People in Santa Cruz. In addition to these valuable collaborative projects, Bill has generously mentored and collaborated with individual undergraduate and graduate students on several of his own important agricultural studies. The impact of such educational experiences have often been profound and lasting. For example, many community studies graduates currently serve as directors and key staff of social service, nonprofits, and governmental agencies throughout and beyond the boundaries of California. Many others have engaged in voluntary contributions to the welfare of the communities in which they work and live. Bill's gift to these graduates has been a gift that keeps on giving. In 2007, Bill Friedland received the campus's first Distinguished Social Science Emeriti Faculty Award, an award bestowed by a committee of faculty and students in recognition of his extraordinary impact as a scholar, teacher, and community servant. I also like to think that it was an award in honor of the considerable wit and good humor that he has brought to serious subjects. Think, for example, of the title of his wonderful book on the tomato industry, De-Stalking the Wily Tomato. Or think of the title for his lecture this evening on the political economy of the California wine industry, a title that both echoes a line from the Battle Hymn of the Republic, perhaps even farther back to the Old Testament, and also hints of John Steinbeck's epic novel, Grapes of Wrath. It is with great pleasure that I present to you this evening Professor Emeritus William Friedland.
Thank you and welcome. I'm delighted to see that there are people interested in a topic like wine from a scholarly point of view. What I will be doing is doing my first, what's it called? First lecture, you know, with all the slides organized. And if there are places where I forget, it is because there's so much information around wine that it is hard for not just one person, but a dozen people working together to understand what is going on. Some people, a couple of friends asked me, what is an academic activist like you doing researching wine? You know, wine is stuff that sells at some places for $1,000 a bottle, and that's hardly the kind of orientation that a union activist or a social activist or an academic activist should pay much attention to. Well, the beginning of this study goes back actually 30 years, and that was because I had finished studies of tomatoes and lettuce, and now I wanted a crop which required longer-term investments. Because if you're in tomatoes, you're a grower of tomatoes or lettuce, you know, if the price goes bad one year, you can shift out to another commodity. But if you're going to invest in wine, if you're going to invest in grapevines, you got to be there for a longer run, since you wait the first 3 years before you get anything from your new grapevines, and then you have to wait another couple of years before you start getting serious production, irrespective of what you're going to do with the grapes. So having finished 2 commodities coming from the grapevine, I then turned to wine, and I found myself in I guess I'll call it a swamp of statistics, a swamp of economics, a swamp of sociology, and so here I am finally coming to grips with this, having said goodbye to all my friends and colleagues with whom I've worked for the last 30 years. And now I am no longer accepting any kind of diversions from this particular study. So let me take you along on this study of wine. Let me get this straight where I have to put my pieces of paper once I've done with them. I'm not going to explain what the political economy of wine is, because my approach to political economy is a very, very broad one. That means that, among other things, I should study as many things that will affect the production and the consumption of wine, and with that mandate, I find myself covering literally dozens and dozens of topics, and what I've done is I've picked out a few to talk about tonight. The first thing I'm going to do is provide a short overview of California wine, if I can find the right button. This is, I don't know if you can read that, it's up at the very, very top, and what it says is, in California, there are 3,655 wineries across 88 regions. That's a lot of wineries. And one thing that you should then reflect about when thinking about wine is that in many respects, it is a reflection of the capacity of people to want to do things and say to themselves, I have a small amount of capital, and I will get into the production of wine. And as happens with a great many people who go into other occupations, other businesses, they find themselves, after a few years, unable to continue. That is to say, there is a continual turnover. Failure is the major causal influence of failure in the wine industry. And one reason that many people hold on is that they develop a kind of a hard commitment to the idea of being a winemaker. And there are people that come into the industry to get rich, and there are people that come into the industry by virtue of the fact that they want to produce a great wine. We have one in California, in Santa Cruz. The Bonnie Doon, Randall Grames, is a guy who is willing to experiment in the long term in order to see if new varietals can be created that will make wine instead of just the ones that are being used now. And that's with the experience of thousands of years of developing varietals among many, many peoples who have settled down with this cluster of varietals, just as we in our world, in the West, have focused upon Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay and a whole cluster of other varietals like that. So some people are interested in the long term beyond their own lives. And that commitment is a remarkable one, and it sustains them as they get along with the wine business. Now, this is a quick picture of where the wineries are located in California. As you will notice, each of those little icons represents a winery. And if you list all the wineries, as somebody has on the web, it takes 52 pages to actually print out the name of the winery, the address, and the telephone number. So we have a lot of wineries here in California. One way to get a sense is to think in terms of a highly specialized form of winemaking, and that's organic winemaking. I picked that out by virtue of the fact that organic is a serious business now nationally. It was one of the places, Santa Cruz was one of the places that got into organic in the early years, and organic in California, there are 92 organic wineries alone, and it is unclear how many are actually organic certified, but this is a growing area within the industry. This shows in the map of California where most of the wine grape growing and winemaking takes place. You'll notice it's largely a coastal phenomenon with a small number of wineries in the Central Valley and a slightly larger in the Sierra foothills. I think you can see that. I hope you can see that. So this is a concentrated agricultural and production system. And that's characteristic of California. If you study California agriculture, one of the things that's notable is some agricultural commodities are very tightly focused in the desert. Some, for example, like Brussels sprouts and artichokes, grow in an area that is about 1 to 3 miles wide at the most and 60 miles long along the coast of California. So geographic focus is a key element in California agriculture, and that is also true with wine. Now, one of the characteristics of wine was initiated a few years back by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which has now changed its name, but is still the reigning bureau that supervises alcohol in the United States. And at one point, they decided that it would be a good idea to introduce the notion coming from France and from Europe more generally, France, Italy, Spain, and a number of other European countries, to create viticultural areas. The theory in Europe is that these appellations, as they call them in Europe, are locations where over hundreds of years winemaking has settled down into a series of patterns of how you actually grow the vines. If there is blending of the vines, you grow the necessary vines for blending in a specified proportion, and when you harvest the grapes, you must harvest them under very, very strict, rigid rules that says you can only take so many tons of grapes off an acre, and during the pruning season, during the winter, pruning is again rigorously specified. Instead, what happened was in the United States, the Treasury Bureau said, we will specify American viticultural areas. Now, what this is a political process which drives organization of winemakers. It did that in Europe, and it does it in the United States. And the consequences you will see in just a second. But to show you how kind of ridiculous the AVAs, as they're usually referred to, the American viticultural areas, I'm showing you the largest area, which is called the Ohio River Valley, AVA. That includes a little bit of New York State, much more of Pennsylvania, almost all of West Virginia, more than half of Ohio, practically all of Kentucky, 2/3 of Indiana, and at least 20% of Illinois. Now, what there is in common of anybody growing grapes in this area defies me, but I'm showing you the largest one, and I will take you to the smallest one in just a minute. This shows you the Appalachians in the Napa Valley, where we have I'll find it in a minute. I think we have 16 or 17 Appalachians in the Napa Valley. The Napa Valley is a small area, and this drove organization into tighter and tighter organizational forms. Now, in the advantage of being in an AVA is that you can put that name on the bottle if you have 75% of the grapes coming from that specific area of an appellation. And Napa is too broad an appellation, although that was the first appellation for that area. But since that time, what you see is the process of winemakers in Napa County organizing themselves, going to the Bureau and saying, we want our own appellation. And this goes through for Sonoma, where there are 15 AVAs, one of which reflects the foolishness in the sense that you notice that green one along the coast, that one stretches from the county border in the north all the way down to the bay. And the assumption that there is some kind of unique organizing principle is mistaken. Now, an appellation can be more than just one of these small units. That is to say, within the appellation of Sonoma, all of these different colors are represented by individual appellations. I'm pointing out in Mendocino County, you'll notice the arrow pointing to a tiny little space. That is the smallest appellation in the United States, roughly about 150 acres, a single vineyard, and it's up in the hills in Mendocino County. It's hard to get to, and somehow or other they managed to get themselves their own appellation. In Mendocino County, there are 10 AVAs. To bring you home, this is Santa Cruz Mountains AVA, which includes most of our county. It includes the border area we share with San Mateo County, and I think it stretches all the way down into, there's a third county, but it's a very, very small segment. You can see the size of that county. Most of that is mountain area, and there's more homogeneity, therefore, to this AVA. This is, again, Santa Cruz County, and this lists all of the wineries in this county, of which there are 70 or 72 of them. So we're talking about an interesting political phenomenon which got introduced, imported from Europe, and which drove organization within the winemaking industry. Now, what I want to do next is I want to turn to the wine revolution. I think almost everybody has heard of the wine revolution. It's a funny business. It's not a revolution the way I used to think about revolutions, but since we can have revolutions about dishwashers or revolutions about toothpaste, I figured I could use revolution because it is generally talked about in those terms within the industry. Where did the wine revolution come from? It started in a period around 1960 and and grew very, very slowly in the 1960s, mostly in the later years of the decade. And in 1970, it began to pick up speed. Where did the revolution come from? I will argue that there were two forces that brought on the wine revolution. One was the changing structure of the U.S. labor force. That is to say, the wine revolution is a product of what has happened to the workforce in America over a period since the Second World War. I'll come back to that in a minute. Well, no, I won't come back to that. I'll talk about it right now. That is to say, no, I will. I'm getting ahead of myself. I wanted to summarize the two major forces for you. One is the changing structure of the labor force, which coalesced in a Bank of America report issued in 1970, which said, wine is the place to be if you want to make money. Now, let me take you first through the changing structure of the labor force. There have been essentially two major revolutions until World War II in the character of the American workforce. The first took place roughly up until the 1880s. Until the 1880s, the majority of the labor force in the United States was in agriculture. And in the 1880s, that began to shift significantly, first slowly, but then increasingly with speed with the turn of the century as we got into the 1900s, and then speeding up from there. That was the first revolution in the labor force. That is to say, agriculture to industry. And in the period roughly from the 1880s to 1950, roughly, our industrial apparatus was the envy of the world. And we had literally hundreds of thousands of industrial workers, and those industrial workers, in effect, set the tone of labor in America and how labor fits into America. I won't go into great detail about that, but I will point out that another revolution took place, beginning actually, these revolutions take time, beginning roughly around 1950. And that was a revolution that was produced as a result of World War II and the way in which labor was organized while the processes of production were organized. And beginning in 1950, white-collar workers began to emerge as the significant segment of the American labor force. Again, a very, very slow process. It took several generations to fulfill that white-collar development. C. Wright Mills wrote a book that was published in 1952, I believe, and he pointed out that this is the major change. And a colleague of his, Daniel Bell, another sociologist, wrote an article in Fortune in 1953 in which, dealing with the issue of how obdurate labor was, how stubborn labor was, how labor had gathered to it a considerable amount of material wealth as a result of its union organizing. Daniel Bell said, and remember this is in Fortune magazine, so it's going out to all the employers in the country. Daniel Bell said, you can stop worrying about labor because from this point on, industrial labor is going to go in decline. And what he was noting was the fact, he and Daniel Bell were noting, was the fact that the children of industrial workers had now gone to college. The GI Bill was in effect, and more people were getting educated and moving into white-collar activity. There was a second stage to this revolution, which took place beginning in the 1960s, although it did not really impinge upon most of us until the 1970s, and that's the information technology society in which we now live, and which is now, so to speak, the driving force of the shaping of American labor. I'll submit you to two tables. The first table deals with a 70-year interval, and if you will notice this column here, this column shows the percentage change that's taking place over a period from 1900 to 1970 in American labor. The next slide shows what happens between 1960 and 1970. Again, go to the column on the right, and you will see astounding percentage increases in not professional, technical, that increases reasonably, but computer specialists, 1,997%. Bank officers, 1,196%. Health administrators, 1,000, et cetera, et cetera. Operators, computers, and peripherals, 5,986% in a 10-year period. Now, what is happening in this process is we now have a labor force which is highly educated. There are still industrial workers, many of them out of work, but the driving force of the economy are these information technology workers who have higher education, they have higher incomes, they have greater discretionary funds, they like to travel, they tend to be more sophisticated than industrial workers, and they have learned to drink wine. And the Bank of America report that came out in 1970 pointed this out. There is the first page of the Bank of America report, and what you can see in the shaded area is the expected rate of growth of wine consumption, per capita consumption of all wine in the United States. So what the Bank of America was saying, invest in wine. The characteristics of who can invest in wine are kind of strange, because wine is not like a lot of small businesses in the United States where you need a small capital of, let's say, $25,000 to open up some kind of shop. $25,000 in wine is peanuts. And the problem is, if you want to start a winery, you have to have all kinds of equipment, you have to have land, you have to plant your grapes, you have to wait 3 years before you start getting any kind of product, and this means that you need a sizable capital to move into wine. So people who move into wine generally have some capital, and usually they bring with them some kind of material experience working in some aspect of the economy. I take two examples. Here's Jess Jackson, who started Kendall Jackson, now called Jackson Family Vineyards. Jess Jackson was a very successful lawyer, and when he moved into wine, he decided he was going to go for the super premium segment of wine. Wine is organized in economic tiers. People buy wine according to their income. If you have an income of several $million per year, you can afford to buy a bottle of wine for $1,000. If you work at the University of California, Santa Cruz, you cannot afford to buy that kind of wine. So you buy in a different tier. When Jess Jackson moved into the industry, he aimed at the super premium, which is $15 to $25, $35, somewhere in there. People are always arguing where the tiers are, where the boundaries are, but the point is that he brought a set of skills and he aimed at a particular segment of wine. Francis Ford Coppola came from Hollywood. He had to have a winery because he was Italian. He grew up with a family that grew wine, and having made his fortune and lost several fortunes in Hollywood, but having retrieved at least one fortune, he decided he wanted to go into wine. Now, when he decided this, he could have put a vineyard in the southern part of the state. Instead, he said, I want the premium part. So he went to Napa. And what he did was he proceeded to buy up pieces of Napa Valley so that he could recreate some of the original vineyard that was considered the greatest vineyard in California in the 1870s and 1880s. And he bought it up, and he's still running that. Now, he did not have, like Jess Jackson, a distinctive tier that he was aiming at. So people bring in different motivations, but they're exemplary of people coming from Silicon Valley and various other kinds of occupations, doctors, dentists, who decide to go into wine. Now, the second major influence that created the modern California wine industry is 1976, and it's referred to as the Judgment of Paris. And this is because in 1976, a Brit who had opened a wine shop in Paris, not far from the American embassy, and his wine shop was a specialty wine shop. It wasn't particularly aimed at a French audience, although it had a lot of French wines. It was aimed at an American and British audience and an English-speaking audience, who, with many, many diplomats and servicing officers in the American and British embassies who might get interested in wine. He ran a series of courses on wine, how to appreciate it, etc. He started hearing about American wine from an American woman who worked for him, Patricia Gallagher. And Patricia Gallagher made a trip to California, went to the various places, including Napa, and she came back and told Spurrier, American wine, California wine, is really very good. You ought to go visit California and find out. So Spurrier did. He went to he came to California, he traveled around, he tasted the wine. He decided that California wine could stand up to French wine. Well, maybe not, but he thought it was good enough to at least have a tasting in Paris of California wine with some very well-established French wines. And in order to do this, he assembled a jury of experts. These are the 9 French judges who participated. Spurrier and Gallagher also participated in the tasting, but their votes did not count. So it was just the French judges whose count was significant. And if you study that, you won't have time to, you will see that there are at least some people there that are highly specialized in the wine industry. A couple of them were not really that much. A couple of them were people that Spurrier just managed to get so that he would have a sizable jury. Where is the slide? There it is. The slide showing the white. The white wines hasn't shown up. These are the wines that were tasted, and there were 6 California wines and 4 Bordeaux wines. And the Bordeaux wines themselves are very well established. These are expensive, very expensive wines. The California wines were very cheap by comparison. And they had to essentially be smuggled into France because hauling American wines to France was not considered to be a good process. But fortunately, there was a group traveling from the United States, from California to France on a wine tour, and Spurrier got each one of them to bring in a bottle of California wine. This shows the rankings of the judges' decisions. Now, what you will notice if you look at the whites is the top one is Chateau Montelena. That is not a French house. That is a Napa house with a French name. And if you look in the reds, you will see Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. So the white lead and the red lead were both California wines. And if you look at the whites, you will see that the second one is truly French, the third one is American, the fourth one is American, the fifth is French, the sixth is American, then follows 2 French wines and then 2 American wines. The reds, the Americans didn't do quite as well. Stag's Leap was the first one, and the next one was Ridge Montebello, the 5th one down, and then they tended to fall more toward the bottom. When the tasters were tasting the white wines, they were having conversations, and that was permitted in the tasting. Some tastings do not permit conversations because individuals should rank the wines according to their individual taste rather than what their colleagues are saying. There was one journalist present at the wine tasting. He was a journalist, George Tabor, who was a correspondent for Time magazine, and he didn't have any big excitement going on in Paris, so he went to the tasting. He had taken a class with Sporia's wine shop, and he heard about it. The journalist was invited, and he turned up, but he was the sole journalist because no French journalist would take an American wine seriously. So he reported that the two top wines were American, California. And that his column appeared on May 31st, 1976, and it had an instant impact, instant. The word spread in New York City. Some people read the article, and they started calling their friends, and the result was that those people started searching out the American wines that had turned up in Paris and been tasted in competition with French wines. And of course, those wines were going for $6 a bottle and $10 a bottle, and there weren't many expensive wines in the shops in New York City, but it had an instant impact, and the result was that in the consumers, wine consumers of the United States, this legitimated California wine for the first time. You have to remember the character of consumption of wine in the East. Those consumers essentially were diplomats, people with money, and people who had traveled abroad, and they too thought nothing about California wines. So they drank French wines. They drank Italian wines. Occasionally they would drink Spanish wines. But California wines, not for drinking. But once this validation had taken place, then in effect, the basis for the revolution and the population that was beginning to be interested in wine was now available, and this started the wine revolution. Here is the cover of the book that George Tabor wrote. He wrote the book much later. I think the book was issued in 2002. But for those of you that may be curious, this is a book worth reading, because what he does is he doesn't just deal with the judgment of Paris, but he deals with the wineries that came to Paris, and he deals with the story of the winemakers and why they started, their individual motivations, their struggles in the early years, etc. And it's a book worth reading to understand the wine revolution. Here's his comment about the conversation in Paris. From their comments, though, I soon realized that the judges were becoming totally confused as they tasted the white wines. The panel couldn't tell the difference between the French wines and those from California. Now, Spuria made a fundamental error in reporting the outcome of the white wine tasting before doing the red wine tasting. So this may have influenced the judges when they then subsequently did the red wine tastings. And one of them, at the end of the whole process, where is she? Odette Kahn, editor of La Revue de Vin de France, asked for the scorecards back. And Spuria refused to deliver them. Okay, so the effects were, first of all, the validation of U.S. wines. I should say more specifically California wines. But there then developed several other processes, social processes. One was to begin mass responses over the years to events in the wine industry, and I'll talk a little bit more about them. The mass effects, I got only a few after the millennium. In 2002, the French paradox suddenly burst upon the United States. What was the French paradox? Turns out that the French ate fatty foods and did not die of heart attacks like the Americans did. And this led to an immediate rush to find out why this took place, and the outcome was red wine. Red wine is the preferred wine in France, and if you will drink red wine, you will avoid the deadly heart attacks. And almost at the same time, Crete was discovered, where families in Crete eat fatty foods all the time, but they also eat very little fatty food, and they eat many vegetables, and they also drink red wine. These two things kind of came together in 2002, and the result was a shift from consuming white wines, which had been the developing lead in the industry. Instead, it shifted to red wines. In 2003, the actual chemical in wine that they thought was responsible for this avoidance of heart attacks was a chemical called resveratrol. And suddenly, everybody was drinking red wine in larger quantities, trying to figure out how much red wine you have to drink to get the proper resveratrol into you. And this then led to the pharmaceutical industry to isolate resveratrol. They had actually isolated it and put it out in pill form so that people now were buying pills with resveratrol and consuming them in order to avoid the heart attacks. Now, I mentioned these as mass effects. That is to say, they happen very, very rapidly because now we have a population which is tied into health, and when something comes along that is concerned with health and you're drinking wine and you can get that right thing from the vine, they rush into buying accordingly. The third mass activity was the movie Sideways. You all remember the movie Sideways? Anybody here see Sideways? Okay, quite a few of you. Remember Miles, the protagonist, is disgusted with Merlot. He only wants to drink Pinot Noir. Now, this is an affectation of Miles, according to a scriptwriter who gave the script to the film this put down on Merlot. And as a matter of fact, I think I've forgotten whether or not Miles pours the wine over his head because he thinks it's Merlot or something like that he's disgusted with Merlot. In any case, there was an immediate drop in the consumption of Merlot in the United States. Now, this is very, very peculiar. Merlot is an important ingredient in many red wines because while I'm blocking on the popular red wine. Somebody tell me what it is. I I can't hear. All right, it'll come to me, but the most popular red wine always has some Merlot in it to soften the harshness of the Cabernet Sauvignon. So Merlot had an immediate drop that took until about a year ago before Merlot recovered on its own. Now, Merlot makes a perfectly good drinking wine. What it does is it saves it resolves the problem of aging wine. If you are drinking Cabernet Sauvignon, very often it will be kind of harsh if it's young. What you should do is lay it down, and 10 years later, it will be drinkable. So it resolves the problem of aging. But the reaction in Merlot was a typical of mass result. Now, there are other consequences. I'll just mention them. One is the Paris tastings, where 9 French tasters tasted 11 wines of red and white, drove the statisticians nuts. And they were trying to figure out what was going on statistically. And since that time, we've had a massive introduction of statistical analysis in wines. And if you take up the Journal of Wine Economics, you will get a good example of how this works. I won't bother you with this anymore. A second one was an attempt of the French to poo-poo the results, to invalidate the results. Now, that's a long story. I won't go into it, but the French worked up a sweat trying to invalidate the results so that they could keep the French drinking French wines rather than shifting to American. And that's still true to this day. A third consequence was that the judgment of Paris was repeated 20 years later, I think it was, in the judgment of Princeton. The Society of Wine Economists met in Princeton that year, and they arranged to do a blind tasting of the French wines which had been tasted in Paris and New Jersey wines. And New Jersey wines came out pretty well in this. And that says something about the general state of the wine industry in the world. And that is the scientific level which has been applied since the end of World War II is truly phenomenal. And a lead agent in this process has been the Department of Viticulture and Enology in Davis, a number of wine science departments in France, and also in Italy and in Spain. And that knowledge has suffused throughout the world. When I first started drinking wine illegally in Staten Island, the most rural borough of New York City, you could get all kinds of wine very, very cheap. I mean, very cheap. A gallon of wine, $1. I don't know how they did it. The result, and that was pretty bad wine. At least it wasn't very good. And nowadays, it's relatively hard to find a bottle of bad wine. Even the tainted cork wine problem has largely been resolved. So that has also been a consequence of the expansion of wine. And the final consequence I'll mention long-term is the importance of numeration. Nowadays, if you study wine, you better know your numbers. You better know the 100% scale, the 100th score scale, Eric Asimov in the New York Times uses 3 stars. Some places they use 20 points. Some magazines would use 20 points. But you better get used to numeration. Okay, now let's see, I don't have a great deal of time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about one big frustration in researching this area, and that is one of the things that you find in political economy studies which are done largely by economists rather than sociologists, one of the things you find is that most economists, when they start these studies, one of the first problems they look into is what is called concentration ratios. And what they mean by that is you take an industrial production system and you find out how many companies there are in it, and you find out then what the total production is, and then you find out how much production is produced, what percentage of production is produced by the top 4 companies, and what percentage of the top 8 companies. And they refer to this as concentration ratio 4 and concentration ratio 8. Now, one of the things that I would like to do, and probably will not succeed in doing, is to calculate the concentration ratio in American wine. Now, one of the characteristics of American wine is there are thousands of wineries in the United States. I mentioned California with over 3,000. In the United States, it's over 9,000. Now, like many industries, many of those wineries are tiny. Some are big, but all the big ones essentially are focused in and around California. And I'll talk about those and try to give you some sense as to what the problem is in trying to discover what the concentration ratio is. Now, this is the listing of the largest U.S. wineries in the United States, which comes from a journal called Wines and Vines, which annually puts out a buyer's guide in which they list as many wineries as they can get by state, and they try to get as much information as to how many the size of vineyards, how many acres the vineyards, how many cases they may sell each year, what their gallonage storage is, because the big wineries have to have lots and lots of storage to handle those. I'm showing you the same thing. Maybe you could read some of these, but you will see that at the top, the first one is Gallo. The second one is Canandaigua. Does that name ring a bell to anybody here? There are 2 or 3 hands. What's that?
Upstate New York.
That's in upstate New York, that's right. It's a company called Canandaigua, and what it is as a true transnational, because it is actually, unlike Gallo, it is the largest winemaker in the world. So the largest winemaker in the world is a company you've never heard of. Now, it's also a company that sells beer. It doesn't make beer, it sells beer. It makes some booze. It has an enormous wine collection in Australia and an enormous one in the United States. The third one is the Wine Group. Has anybody heard of the Wine Group? 2, 3? So there are a few people. The fourth one is Golden State Vintners. Golden State Vintners has disappeared. It was the fourth largest. This is an ancient one from 1999 or something, like 2002. And I need to get my data updated, and I'm in the process of doing it. The Golden State Vintners was the fourth largest. The fifth largest was JFJ Bronco. Anybody heard of Bronco? Again, a couple of people. There must be some wine experts here. You recognize these names. Bronco is a company which is run by three children or grandchildren, the children of the Francia brothers, because the Francia brothers winery ended when it was sold to Coca-Cola Company of New York some years ago. That was when Coca-Cola was going into wine big, and its New York affiliate bought Francia Brothers. And this is characteristic, and I will show you a slide of, but first I want to show you a different approach. Oh, this one is readable up here on my screen. Okay. Now, this is a collection from Wine Business Monthly, a monthly magazine put out for wine businesses. They send a newsletter around 5 days a week, which drives me crazy, because if I don't read it, I'll feel that I'm missing something. But this shows the top U.S. wine companies in 2002. And what you will see is Gallo is first, Canandaigua is second, the wine group is third. So there is at least there is a kind of continuity of those three companies in the top grouping. Now, what they're trying to do, both Wines and Vines and the Wine Business Monthly, what they're trying to do is to get some handle on what the economic concentration process is. And it's very, very difficult. There was a period roughly around 2002 to 2005 when these big wineries were swallowing up smaller wineries. And I'm going to show you a change that took place between 2007 and 2003 in the top 30 wineries from Wine Business Monthly. 4 wineries were bought up by Constellation, which was an earlier name for Canandaigua. And the biggest of these was Robert Mondavi. But Allied Domecq, which had been a combination French and British with interests in the United States, was also bought up. They were previously 12th in rank. Robert Mondavi was 6th in rank. Phelps Hogue was 15th in rank, and Peak Wines was 17th in rank. Those 4 disappeared because they were eaten by Constellation. Foster's, which was an Australian company later bought by Constellation, bought up Beringer Blas. The wine group bought up Golden State Vintners. Diageo, which is a multinational British base, bought up Chalone. And finally, Gallo bought up Barefoot Cellars. So in a 3-year period, 8 wineries in the top 30 disappeared into bigger wineries. And this leads to disturbances in the industry. People get uneasy about how big they're getting, and there's supposed to be monitoring of this by the federal government, but it doesn't seem that much monitoring is going on. Okay, what I'm going on is to deal briefly with a study which was issued in December last year with Phil Howard of Michigan State University, in which he and a group of faculty and students started looking at wine in Michigan, and they were not looking at wine production in Michigan, because wine production in Michigan is very, very small. So in order to study that, what they do is they went and they studied how wine appears at retail. And here is one of the things that they did in this study. This shows Gallo, and all those lines leading to all those little circles represents some of the companies that Gallo owns. This is not a complete index of it. Then from the basis of what they studied at retail, they said these are the top 5 wine firms in the country, and these are their brands. So each grape has a name of a label. The first one is Gallo, first on the left. The next one going across is the Wine Group. The third one is Constellation. The 2 ones down at the bottom are Treasury, and then Trinchero. Trinchero is a family winery which has grown very, very big over the last 30 years. Here is, you can't read them, I don't think I can read them here, but this represents the brands that Constellation has. Okay, now I've been talking for about 40 minutes. I want to take you very, very quickly through the business of wine tasting, and I'm only going to go partially through this. This is an article that appeared in last Thursday's New York Times. It's an article on an Oxbridge confrontation over wine tasting, which has been going on for 60 years in the UK, in which 2 teams assembled from Oxford and Cambridge come and taste wines and try to guess which wines are which. 8 men and 6 women tasters have to judge, and this is blind, 12 wines by grape, that is to say, identify the varietal that the wine was made from. That's number 1. Country of origin, region within the country, sub-region, that is to say, appellation, vintage, the year it was produced, and taste characteristics. Now, I would like to attend that kind of a tasting to see how successful these people are. This is incredible. What this does is it restores my belief that there are some very, very good tasters. But the rest of my report, and I'm running out of time, deals with my skepticism about tasters. And I start with the French tasters and show the range. Now, in this slide, what I've done is taken the range of, these are the Chardonnays that were tasted in France, in Paris, and this was the interval between the top and the bottom tasting the Chateau Montelena wine, the Mercier Charmes wine, the Chalon Vineyards wine, etc. And you can see that the interval size is 15.5. They're using a 20 interval rating system. So out of a 20 interval rating system, there were ratings of 15.5 intervals between the top and the bottom on that first wine. And that was the wine that nevertheless emerged at the top, which tells you that there was one very, very low one, maybe one in the middle, and then the rest all the way close to the top. But you can see that there are very substantial intervals. You go down the list, 5, 6, 7, then you get an interval of 11, an interval of 8, and the 4 last intervals are 10 or more in size. Now, what that says to me is if you have 9 tasters and you get that kind of a range, what that says is these so-called experts don't have a uniform tasting capacity. I would expect wine tasters to have some variation, but variations as large as shown here, that strikes me as indicative that some of these tasters don't know what they're doing. And then what I did in the rest of my talk, and I will not burden you with, was to taste a challenge between 2 wine spectator tasters tasting exactly the same wines, and where I get these same kinds of intervals. I'll stop now. I think I've given you some sense as to what the political economy of wine is beginning to look like. It will be a much more elaborated study. Thank you very much.